So as we see, when Russell begins to describe his experience of ordinary objects, like physical objects around him, what seemed simple becomes mysterious, complex. We begin to wonder in that way that Aristotle said philosophers do, or philosophy makes us wonder. Ordinarily, we would say, well, when I look at the table, I am perceiving the table. I am aware of the table. But as Russell points out, it may not be so simple. When I am aware of the table, let's say I'm aware of the color of the table. However, what he's argued is that the color of the table is not an inherent feature of this external object, the table. The color is really, one would imagine, a subjective phenomenon within me that I'm experiencing. Now, perhaps that phenomenon is caused in some way by an external object, which we would call the table. But that color is, one might say, is something that I'm experiencing within myself, even though I attribute it to an outside object, and I really experience it as the color of an external object. But upon further thought, it would seem that the color and the texture and even the shape of the table cannot be said to be internal or inherent features of the table, the physical object, the thing in the world that's distinct from me, but rather it seemed to be what he calls sense data, that is, things that we're aware of, but that aren't necessarily things in the world, but rather, one might say, ideas or things in ourselves. Now, that becomes a little complicated later on, but this raises some very difficult questions then. I started out by saying that when I look at the table, I'm aware of the table. But Russell argues us to the point where we would concede, if we're following and agreeing with his line of argument, that we're not aware of the table at all. We're aware of our impressions, one might say, of the table. We're aware not of the table immediately, we're aware of our sense data immediately. So then he asks the question, if I can find it. Yeah, this is the bottom of page 4. He's talking about the difference between sensation, which is the experience of sensing something, as opposed to a sense datum, which is what we are aware of. He says, thus a problem arises as to the relation of the sense data to the real table, supposing there is such a thing. That is, we assume that there are physical objects in the world that are external to us, that are independent of us, and that somehow or another we become aware of them through our senses. We can think about them, we can see them, touch them, etc., experience them in different ways. However, if it's true that in our ordinary sense experience, strictly speaking, what we are experiencing are simply our own sense data, which is really states of ourselves rather than the object, then the question is not only how do those sense data actually relate to physical objects, but even more radically, are there any physical objects at all? That is, this is what leads him to the discussion of idealism, of metaphysical idealism, which we'll be looking at in some more detail later in the semester in the so-called reality section of the course. But already we're talking about it, from asking questions primarily about knowledge, which was my point in the earlier video. But the question does arise, if all of our experience, let's say, is subjective, in the sense that all of our experience directly, what we're directly aware of, at least in terms of the physical world, what we take to be the physical world, if what we're directly aware of are our own subjective states, and we are never immediately, directly aware of anything like a physical object that is distinct from us and that is external to us, then what reason do we have for saying that those things exist at all? How can we know that they exist? Now, common sense tells us that they do. We live our lives on the absolute assumption, unquestioned assumption, that there is a physical world and that we have to deal with. We have to get out of the way of that moving bus. We have to find something to eat. We have to breathe the oxygen around us, and that's all on the assumption that there is a physical world independent of us. But this is philosophy after all, right? I said in the opening video about Aristotle that philosophy does not justify itself by means of its practical value. That is nonsense, and don't let anyone ever tell you that. That's not what philosophy is about. Philosophy is about asking questions which are intrinsically interesting. Philosophy is about gaining knowledge of the most important things, according to Aristotle. Now, that's all questionable, right? Whether he really offers knowledge and whether these questions are the most important things. But that at least is the claim of philosophy, and that's really the only way that we can justify doing what we're doing in this class. We can ask ourselves, we take it for granted that the external world of physical objects, now that I mean just the ordinary things, bodies, material things, everything around us that we know or think that we know through the senses, we can ask ourselves whether it really exists, and if it does, what is the proof of it? What is the foundation of that claim? A very interesting thing that Russell says twice, actually, on page 4, is he uses the word infer or inference, which is a great logic word, a great philosophy word. He says something, really interesting. Not the first person to say it, but about our knowledge and experience of the external world. Look at any object around you that's around you right now. I'll look at my coffee cup. Okay. Experience it in all the ways. Touch it, smell it, look at it, even listen to it if you can get it to make a noise. Have you experienced the physical object directly? No, according to Russell. So, what is the physical object? Well, he says the physical object is an inference you make on the basis of what you do experience directly, which is a certain subjective impression of a texture when you touch it, a certain changing, mutable, subjective impression when you look at it from different angles and move it around, and the same for the other senses. Right? That is, we believe that there's a coffee cup. I believe there's a coffee cup in my hand. But that belief is an inference, or it's based on an inference I make from my direct sense experience, which again are states of myself, Russell says, really, rather than states of an external thing. I make an inference on the basis of what I experience directly, that there is a physical object out there. So the question really is, first of all, that's, I think, in itself, if you can get that from this chapter, you've gotten a lot. That is, the claim that our knowledge of the physical objects around us is merely an inference that we make on the basis of what we do experience directly, which are sense data, so-called. If you just get that from this chapter, that would be great. Because it may not be true, but it's a very important and interesting idea in philosophy. But this questionability of the reality of external objects leads us to, in this chapter, the discussion of idealism, which is a very radical metaphysics, the theory of reality. It says that, well, come to think of it, there's no good reason for believing that physical objects, what Russell calls matter, as opposed to mind and ideas, there's no good reason for saying that such things exist. In fact, Berkeley, as we'll see, the philosopher Berkeley from the 18th century, British philosopher, Irish philosopher actually, says that it's a manifest contradiction to say that matter exists, and we'll see why. And not only does it probably not exist, according to him it couldn't exist. It doesn't even make any sense, logically speaking, that it exists. That all that exists are ideas, and the minds that think them. That's, after all we're familiar with. We've never experienced a physical object, Berkeley says. We've only experienced our ideas. And those ideas may be of something that we call a physical object. So we get already into metaphysics and idealism. That is, the idea that and Russell has some sympathy for this, but also resists this to some extent, this idealism. That everything that exists is ideas. We'll look later on at metaphysics, theories of reality that say that all that exists is material things. So it's not just one thing. So a very interesting beginning, and you got to think this through yourself. There'll be study questions, obviously, and discussion, and these videos don't cover and could not possibly cover everything that's said, even in a short reading like this. But I would like just to point out what Russell says at the end, which is great, and one of the reasons I'm giving it to you. On page 7, towards the bottom, he says, "Such questions are bewildering, and it is difficult to know that even the strangest hypotheses may not be true. Thus our familiar table, which has roused but the slightest thoughts in us hitherto, has become a problem full of surprising possibilities. The one thing we know about it is that it is not what it seems." And this is Russell's idea, really his Aristotelian, his version of Aristotle's idea that philosophy is about wonder, and it's about exposing how wonderful the world is. And for the world to be wonderful, it has to be puzzling and questionable and not obvious. He even uses the word wonder at the very end on page 8. He says, "Philosophy, if it cannot answer so many questions as we could wish, has at least the power of asking questions which increase the interest of the world and show the strangeness and wonder lying just below the surface, even in the commonest things of daily life."